They said it couldn't be done, that a 4-ton truck couldn't pull a gun through a world on fire. But in every theatre, from the dunes of Libya to the fields of Normandy, one machine refused to give in. The Morris C8 didn't roar like a tank or soar like a Spitfire. It just worked, mile after mile, hauling Britain's artillery through hell and back. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but when victory depended on movement, this was the beast that never quit. It began not with a design brief, but with a problem. The British Army's guns could move no faster than the horses that dragged them. In the muddy lessons of the First World War, artillery had decided battles, but it had also been their burden. In 1916, a single 18-pounder required 6 horses and a team of men just to shift it a few miles through the Somme mire. By 1938, the next war was already forming on the horizon, and the War Office knew that horsepower, not horses, would decide who held Europe. Enter Morris Commercial Cars Limited, Birmingham. Known before the war for reliable trucks and postal vans, they were chosen to build something entirely different, a field artillery tractor, a vehicle that could carry a crew, haul a 25-pounder, and survive every climate the Empire might fight in. It had to be short enough for naval transport, light enough for bridges, and powerful enough to pull an entire gun team and limber over a ridge. In effect, it had to be the world's first true mobile artillery system. Chief Engineer Alec Isigonis, the same man who would later design the Mini, was among those who studied its layout. Simplicity was the creed. The chassis was compact, the frame overbuilt, and the new all-wheel drive system borrowed from experimental lorries used in India. The engine, a 4.0-litre inline-4, was tuned not for speed, but torque. The goal, a machine that could crawl through anything, no matter how deep, no matter how long. In late 1939, the prototype known as the Morris C8 Mk1 Quad rolled onto the proving ground. The War Office observers were unimpressed at first sight. It looked awkward. Cab slanted forward like a crouched animal, with huge balloon tyres and a snub nose. But once it started moving, doubts vanished. It clawed through churned earth where nothing else could. When its front wheels lifted from the mud, the rear ones dragged it through anyway. One test officer wrote simply, "This vehicle is possessed of a stubborn mechanical soul." That was enough for approval. Production began at Adderley Park under blackout conditions. The line filled with young women and older tradesmen, many veterans of the last war. Birmingham's air raid sirens became their soundtrack. By the spring of 1940, hundreds of quads were rolling out each month. They were sent straight to the newly reconstituted British Expeditionary Force in France. There, the C8 faced its first trial under fire. Convoys moved through Flanders mud, towing 25-pounders whose recoil alone could buckle lesser trucks. When the order to retreat came, the quads hauled guns, men, and even wounded across shell-pocked fields. Some crews cut away canvas tops for faster escape. Others stripped weight to load refugees or extra ammunition. Many were destroyed to prevent capture, but enough survived to prove a truth that would define them. The Morris C8 didn't break. It simply endured until there was nothing left to pull. Those left behind at Dunkirk were found later by advancing German units, engines shot out, still harnessed to their guns. A Wehrmacht engineer inspecting one wrote, "The English truck is ugly, but will not die." That line circulated through captured reports, a backhanded compliment that became legend among British mechanics. By 1941, Morris released the Mk2 with thicker steel, improved suspension, and a redesigned cab. The war was changing, and so was the machine. It would need to, because the next battlefield would be hotter, harsher, and far less forgiving. The Morris C8 was a creature of purpose. Every line, every rivet was built to solve a problem: mud, sand, weight, traction, space. To the untrained eye, it was a box on wheels. To its crews, it was a machine designed by people who understood soldiers. The cab sat low and sloped forward, not for aesthetics, but for survival. A glancing shell fragment would skip rather than penetrate. Its rounded bonnet wasn't style, it was deflection. Inside, two simple levers controlled four-wheel drive and low gear. A man could learn to operate it in an hour. Underneath, leaf springs were mounted high to absorb punishment. Every component was overspec'd, every bolt accessible by spanner. Field repairs could be done blindfolded, and often were. The 4.0-litre engine, known internally as the Morris EH, delivered only 70 horsepower. But torque was its weapon. It could pull twice its rated load up a 1 in 3 gradient without stalling. In desert trials, engineers found that even with a seized piston, the engine would run on 3 cylinders long enough to reach safety. Mechanics joked that the C8 didn't run on petrol. It ran on spite. The cab seated 6 uncomfortably: driver, commander, layer, loader, and 2 gunners. They lived elbow to elbow among spare parts, shell cases, and the smell of hot metal. Canvas flaps offered token protection from weather. In North Africa, crews removed them entirely. The heat was worse than the dust, but comfort wasn't part of the specification. The C8's genius lay in its adaptability. It could haul a 25-pounder, a 6-pounder anti-tank gun, even the heavier 17-pounder under strain. It could winch itself out of bogs, cross waddies, and climb dunes where tanks sank. And unlike tanks, it didn't need armour to survive, only reliability. By 1942, the Morris factories were operating around the clock. Bombs fell on Birmingham, but production barely slowed. When machine tools were destroyed, workers shifted assembly lines overnight. Engines were cast in Coventry, gearboxes in Oxford, final assembly back in Adderley Park. The war had turned Britain into one vast interconnected workshop, and the C8 was its backbone. By the time the first Morris C8s rolled into the North African theatre, the desert had already eaten armies alive. Engines choked on dust finer than flour, tyres shredded on rock, and metal cracked under heat that could warp rifle barrels. To fight Rommel's Afrika Korps in such a place required more than courage. It demanded machinery that could endure the impossible. The C8 arrived quietly, aboard Liberty ships docking at Alexandria. Its crews, drawn from the Royal Artillery and trained at Larkhill, quickly learned that this new theatre was a mechanics' war as much as a gunner's. Every morning began not with reveille, but with maintenance. Air filters were stripped, spark plugs cleaned, tyres inspected, bolts tightened by feel before the sun rose high enough to burn skin through khaki. At first, the men doubted the C8's strange shape. The cab's forward slope seemed impractical in the blinding sun, the tyres overwide for rock, and its weight, nearly 4 tons empty, made it slow. But when the first convoys moved toward Mersa Matruh, the doubts burned away with the horizon. Where lighter trucks bogged, the Morris crawled through. Where captured German half-tracks overheated, the C8 ran cool and steady. The desert, for all its cruelty, respected discipline, and the C8 embodied it. Every battle brought new lessons. During Operation Crusader, the 8th Army learned to leapfrog its artillery. The quads towed the 25-pounders forward in pairs. One would unhook and fire, while the other advanced to the next ridge. When enemy counterfire began, the first crew hooked up again and moved ahead. It was a ballet of steel and timing, and the C8's reliability made it possible. Crews began to personalize their machines. Names appeared stenciled in white paint on the sloped cabs: Faithful, Gun Mule, Mrs. Morris, Gertie. They were not vanity. They were a kind of pact between man and machine. In a war where so much depended on luck, the Morris gave them something solid to believe in. Mechanics made miracles in the sand. Radiators repaired with condensed milk tins, engines flushed with petrol when water ran out, tyres wrapped in canvas to cross sharp gravel. The Morris responded like a living thing. Its clutch could be rebuilt in the field, its gearbox replaced with nothing more than a crowbar and determination. If a C8 stopped, it wasn't for long. At El Alamein, the real test came. For 12 days and nights, the 8th Army's guns fired almost continuously, the 25-pounders moving forward in stages under cover of darkness. When dawn came, each battery had to displace before German counterfire found them. That meant one thing: quads in motion, every hour, every night. Drivers navigated by instinct, following the faint glow of the truck ahead, counting ridges and dunes in the dark. The desert was alive with the sound of gears grinding and winches clanking. When a gun bogged down, another C8 pulled it free. When an axle broke, crews cannibalized spares from wrecks. By the end of the battle, some quads had been running 20 hours a day for 2 weeks straight. Engines wheezed, tyres melted, but they kept going. A war correspondent visiting the front wrote, "They call them tractors, but they move like beasts, stubborn, low, relentless. They do not gallop, they crawl, and that is why they never stop." In the aftermath of Alamein, the British artillery doctrine changed. Speed of displacement became central to every plan. The 25-pounder was no longer a static gun. It was mobile firepower, made possible by the C8. For the first time, artillery could keep pace with tanks. The Morris had turned an old arm into a modern one. When the campaign ended in Tunisia, the desert veterans said goodbye to their machines like comrades. Some had been burned out by heat, others lost to enemy shell fire. But those that survived were loaded onto transports again, bound for the next front, Italy. And for the crews, it was unthinkable to face another war zone without their quads. They had learned the desert's secret. Victory wasn't about power, it was about endurance. Italy was a different kind of enemy. Gone was the endless horizon. Now there were mountains, rain, and mud so thick it swallowed boots whole. The roads were ancient Roman stonework, cracked and slick, and every bend could hide an ambush. Where the desert had tested endurance, Italy tested traction, patience, and nerve. The C8 adapted again. Crews fitted snow chains, scavenged from abandoned vehicles, wrapped exhausts with canvas to keep out water, and learned to drive by ear in the fog. Engines were tuned for altitude, carburetors adjusted by feel. In some regions, petrol froze overnight, so men lit small fires under sumps before dawn to coax the engines awake. The Morris always started. It might cough, it might shudder, but it started. Here the quad became more than a tow vehicle. It became shelter. Crews slept inside, ate inside, waited out artillery barrages inside. One gunner wrote home, "If it weren't for the quad, I'd have drowned twice." It leaks less than the tents. The Italian campaign was relentless. From Salerno to Cassino to the Gothic line, every advance depended on guns being in position before dawn. The terrain made that nearly impossible, except for the quads. They carved new roads, dragged limbers through rivers, even acted as recovery vehicles for smaller jeeps. Their low gearing and weight gave them traction where tanks spun helplessly. The Germans learned to target the quads first. A destroyed tractor meant a silent gun. Crews began camouflaging their cabs with branches and mud, blending them into the landscape. At Cassino, one battery hid its entire column beneath a vineyard canopy. The C8s parked between vines like sleeping beasts. They fired from there for 3 weeks without being spotted. When the spring offensive came in 1945, the quads led the advance again. They hauled the 25-pounders through broken villages and mountain passes, their tyres leaving deep ruts in the thawing ground. When the war in Italy finally ended, the gunners held a small ceremony beside their vehicles. They cleaned the mud from the bonnets and painted a single word on each: home. By 1944, the war had come full circle. The British Army was going back to France, not as retreating survivors, but as a force ready to end what it had begun. For that, the guns would need to move again, and only one machine had proved it could follow them anywhere, the Morris C8 Mark III. The latest version of the quad was heavier, more refined, and far more battle-proven. It carried lessons written in oil and dust from every front that came before. A redesigned cab offered more space and visibility. The air intake was raised to handle river crossings. Engineers strengthened the chassis and added a deeper winch mount for recovering other vehicles, a nod to the crews who had used their quads as rescue machines in Italy. On the eve of D-Day, thousands of them were marshalled along the English coast. Their cabs were waterproofed, their ammunition sealed in oilskin, their names painted over with new serials. In quiet moments, crews polished brass and patched dents that told years of stories. Some had been with the same vehicle since Africa. One driver from the Royal Artillery described his C8 as a dog that never knew how to lie down. When the invasion came, the quads were part of the second wave. They rolled off landing craft behind the tanks, towing 25-pounders wrapped in tarpaulin. The beach was chaos, smoke, wreckage, shrapnel bouncing like rain. Engines screamed under strain, tires spun in sand, but the C8s clawed forward one by one, dragging their guns towards solid ground. Behind them, men followed the ruts they left, the first roads of the new front carved by the old beasts. In the bocage country, the quads met a new enemy, the hedge. Tall, thick, rooted in centuries of soil, it was perfect for ambush and terrible for mobility. The narrow lanes were traps for tanks, but the C8, shorter and more nimble, became the lifeline again. It could back its gun into a hedgerow, fire, and pull away before counterfire arrived. Crews learned to judge a lane by feel, the turn radius, the angle, the sound of the branches brushing the cab. When you drove a quad long enough, you didn't steer it. You guided it like an animal that already knew the way. The German 80s stalked every movement, but the British guns struck first more often than not. That rhythm, move, fire, move again, became second nature. It kept the pressure on, kept the advance alive, and every inch gained across Normandy's patchwork fields owed something to those patient machines. The summer campaign ground on. In the dust of France, the C8's engine note became a kind of heartbeat. When infantry heard it, they knew support was near. When tanks broke down, they called for the quads. When the ammunition columns needed a tow through bombed-out roads, the quads led. They were the quiet power beneath the noise of war, not dramatic, not deadly, but absolutely dependable. By autumn, the C8s were rolling through Belgium, Holland, and finally toward the Rhine. Mud returned, worse than Italy, and yet the story stayed the same. They didn't quit. Even with engines seized from frost or radiators holed by shrapnel, the crews coaxed them forward. A few were lost in flooded dikes, swallowed whole by the mud. Their crews marked the spots with small wooden signs, "Still pulling." When victory finally came in May 1945, many of the Morris C8s were too worn to continue. Their tires were bald, their frames twisted from years of hauling beyond capacity. But in every artillery regiment across Europe, the crews gathered one last time to clean them, to patch them, to make them whole before sending them home. The war had made machines into comrades, and the bond wasn't easily broken. Back in Britain, the surviving quads returned to depots. Some were refitted for new service, others were sold to farmers, stripped of guns but not of grit. In the fields of Yorkshire and Kent, they ploughed, towed and laboured for another 20 years. Children climbed on them without knowing what those machines had seen. They just saw a truck that could do anything, and in truth, that's what it always was. War had ended, but the engineers weren't finished. They knew that the principles behind the Morris C8, torque, traction, simplicity, were timeless. They had built something more than a tractor. They had built a philosophy of movement. The Mk3 was already the culmination of that idea, but even as victory parades filled London, drafts were being drawn for what would come next. Vehicles that could haul bigger guns, cross rivers, and operate in new climates. The C8's descendants would appear everywhere, in post-war recovery trucks, in the 1950s 6x6 gun tractors, even in early armoured personnel carriers. Every one of them bore the same genetic code: simple mechanics, uncompromising reliability, and the ability to be repaired anywhere, by anyone. At Morris, returning workers were greeted by walls of spare parts. Engines salvaged from wrecked quads were rebuilt, gearboxes retooled, frames repurposed. Nothing went to waste. For many engineers, it was personal. They had built these machines in blackout and bomb raids. Now they were bringing them back to life in daylight. One of the designers, years later, summed it up best: "We weren't building trucks. We were building endurance into metal." The war had forced Britain to industrialize with urgency, but it also forced its machines to grow up, to evolve from products into partners. The C8 was proof that reliability was as decisive as firepower. Its legacy wouldn't just live in museums or old photographs, it would live in the very concept of how an army moves. Even after newer tractors replaced it, the C8 remained in reserve service into the early 1950s. Many were shipped to Commonwealth nations, India, Canada, Australia, where they served through Korea and beyond. A few even returned to Africa, their new crews unaware that their vehicles were veterans returning to familiar dust. Everywhere they went, they carried the same quiet lesson: that the most powerful machine is the one that never gives up. Machines alone don't win wars, men do. And the men who drove, maintained, and lived inside the Morris C8 were as much a part of the machine as its gears and pistons. Every gun tractor had a personality because every crew gave it one. They painted nicknames on the doors, carved initials into dashboards, and talked to them as if they could hear. In the rain of Italy, they cursed them like mules. In the desert, they spoke to them softly, not out of superstition, but out of respect, because the Morris always listened. If you treated it right, it would never leave you stranded. A gun crew consisted of 6 to 8 men, depending on the gun type. Each had a role: driver, commander, layer, loader, and ammunition handlers. But the Morris made them one. Inside that cramped cab, hierarchy blurred. The officer sat shoulder to shoulder with the driver, both covered in grease and smoke. When a tire burst or a wheel bogged, rank didn't matter, only teamwork did. Morning routine began long before first light. Engines had to be checked, gear inspected, guns cleaned, ammunition accounted for. Fuel and oil were always precious, every drop measured. Crews developed rituals, tapping the fuel gauge twice before starting, spitting on the wheel nut for luck, lighting one cigarette before ignition. Small habits that gave structure to chaos. When they drove, conversations stopped. The engine note filled everything, a deep, steady growl that vibrated through bones. You could tell a good driver by how he listened. He could hear when a bearing was going, when a tire was soft, when the gearbox needed coaxing. They didn't read gauges. They read sound. That connection was what made the Morris different from any other vehicle in the army. It wasn't just operated, it was understood. In North Africa, crews learned to strip the carburettor blindfolded. In Italy, they could change a clutch in the rain. In France, they learned to drive in blackout, using only the shadow of the man ahead. Each adaptation came from need, not instruction. The manuals were written in factories. The wisdom was written in the field. At night, when the guns were silent, the C8s became shelters. The men folded tarpaulins over the windows, rigged lamps from shell casings, and brewed tea on petrol stoves. Some slept curled on the floor, others on the gun trail outside. Letters from home were tucked behind speedometers, photos glued to dashboards. There was comfort in routine, clean the filters, stow the shells, check the brakes, boil water, write. It was in those moments the bond between man and machine deepened beyond duty. One sergeant later said, "We didn't drive the Morris, we lived inside it. It was our house, our horse, and our friend." There was humour too. When a Morris stalled under fire, crews swore it was only being stubborn. When it backfired, they called it applause. One driver claimed his had a taste for Italian wine after a convoy break-in, and refused to run on regular petrol for 2 days after. Even in war, men find ways to laugh with what keeps them alive. Accidents were inevitable. A C8 weighed nearly 4 tons, and when it slipped on mud or stone, it could crush a man in seconds. Crews learned to keep clear of winch cables and to never trust a brake on an incline. But those who lived through it called the Morris forgiving. Unlike faster machines, it gave warnings, groans, rattles, smells, hints that something was wrong. If you paid attention, it kept you safe. By 1945, the men who'd driven quads across continents could recognize their own engines by ear from half a mile away. They could tell who was driving by, how the gears changed. It was a kind of mechanical intimacy no modern army has known since. When they went home, that bond lingered. Many veterans bought surplus quads at auction, driving them on farms or keeping them in barns long after the war. They said it was the sound they missed, that steady, low rhythm of work and faith. You could trust a Morris. And for men who'd spent years trusting only that, the silence of peace felt strange. The 25-pounder gun is remembered as one of the finest field artillery pieces of the Second World War, fast, accurate, adaptable. But behind every shot, behind every battery that moved and fired and moved again, there was a Morris C8. The British Army learned a simple truth early in the war. Artillery wasn't just about firepower, it was about positioning. A gun that couldn't move was a target. A gun that could move at will was a weapon of dominance. And no gun moved more smoothly, more reliably, or more often than those hauled by a C8. In official post-war reports, analysts noted that the C8 had increased artillery mobility by nearly 40%. It cut average redeployment times in half, allowed for sustained operations without dedicated recovery vehicles, and reduced breakdown rates to a record low. Numbers that might sound bureaucratic until you remember what they meant in the field. Fewer dead men, faster support, and a constant rhythm of fire that never faltered. During major offensives, the C8 became the heartbeat of the British line. When infantry advanced, they listened for its growl. When commanders called for fire, they knew the guns would be in place because the quads were already moving. At night, the sound of those engines rolling forward through the dark meant hope. To the Germans, it meant trouble. Captured Wehrmacht reports mention the persistent British gun columns, vehicles that appeared again and again after bombardments, seemingly impossible to destroy. Many German officers assumed they were armoured because nothing else could survive that exposure. In reality, it was just the quads and their crews, using speed, precision, and nerve to stay alive. When historians write about the mobility revolution of World War II, they often focus on tanks or half-tracks. But the Morris C8 quietly did the same for artillery. It was the unseen gear in the machine of victory, the weapon behind the weapon. Even its failures were successes. In Tunisia, one quad famously lost its clutch during a retreat. The driver, refusing to abandon his gun, started the engine in gear, timed every stop perfectly, and completed 50 miles of towing without shifting once. When he arrived at base, the gun was intact, the Morris smoking, but still idling. He received no medal. He said, "The beast just didn't want to stop." By the end of the war, the phrase had become common. When in doubt, take the quad. It meant reliability. It meant trust. It meant something built to last, even when men didn't. Behind every Morris C8 that crossed a battlefield, There was another army, one without uniforms, without medals, and without fanfare. The workers who built the quads fought their own war, one of deadlines, danger, and determination. They were Britain's industrial front line. Adderley Park in Birmingham had built commercial trucks for years before the war, but when the first contracts arrived in 1939, it transformed overnight. Civilian lorries were replaced by gun tractors, the lights were blacked out, and the air raid sirens became the shift bell. Men too old to fight worked beside women who had never seen a machine shop before. Teenagers fetched tools for welders twice their age. Foremen measured output not by hours, but by urgency. How many can we finish before the next raid? During the Blitz, the factory was hit several times. The roof was blown open, windows shattered, assembly lines buried under rubble. Yet production didn't stop. Workers cleared debris by hand, salvaged parts from wreckage, and built new frames on open ground. Photographs show quads being assembled under tarpaulins while bombers droned overhead. The men called it open-air manufacturing. In Coventry, Morris subcontractors produced engines and transmissions. When the city was devastated in November 1940, engine blocks were pulled from the ruins of machine shops and finished on temporary benches. Every part mattered. Each one was a promise to the men waiting in the desert for a replacement that might mean life or death. Women became the backbone of production. By 1942, nearly 60% of the C8 workforce was female. They welded, riveted, wired, painted, tested. Many had never handled machinery before, but the need was absolute. They learned fast, improvising when manuals didn't exist, often redesigning processes on the spot. One forewoman, when asked how she managed to keep her section producing under blackout, simply said, "We can build by feel now." Every vehicle that left the factory carried a small tag riveted to the chassis. Morris Commercial Cars, Adderley Park. It was a mark of pride. For many of those workers, it was the only part of the war they could touch directly. When they saw a photograph of a quad on the front page, coated in dust, towing a gun through chaos, they saw their own handiwork, surviving the unimaginable. Suppliers across Britain kept the supply chain alive like veins of a living body. Tyres from Dunlop in Coventry, gearboxes from Morris in Oxford, magnetos from Lucas in Birmingham, carburettors from SU in Croydon. Trains carried the parts between cities under blackout, their schedules known only to a handful of officers. Sabotage, bombing and shortages were constant threats, but somehow the flow never stopped. The quads kept coming. To the workers, these trucks weren't abstract machines. They were extensions of their own endurance. One woman later recalled, "We built them to survive because we wanted our boys to survive." The Ministry of Supply sent weekly quotas that seemed impossible. When the workforce hit them, the bar was raised again. At peak production in 1943, a completed Morris C8 rolled off the line every 48 minutes. They worked 6 days a week, often through the night. On Sundays, the factory went silent only long enough for cleaning, inspection, and brief rest. When the tide of war turned in North Africa, the workers received their first letters from the front, short notes of thanks written on battered paper and delivered through official channels. One read simply, "Yours started first time in the sand. It brought us home." That single line was pinned to a notice board and stayed there until the war's end. Production continued until mid-1945, when victory in Europe brought new orders, demobilization, refit, reconditioning. The same hands that had built the C8s now rebuilt them for peace. Engines were cleaned, armor plates removed, frames straightened. Many workers wept as they watched the last wartime batch roll out. The sound of the engines had been the pulse of their lives for 6 years. Now the silence felt strange. What they didn't know was that the world they'd helped build, the world of reliable, standardized, adaptable machines, would become the blueprint for modern industry. The C-8 wasn't just a military triumph, it was a lesson in collaboration, logistics, and design under pressure. It was proof that when a nation's factories think as one, they can move mountains, or in this case, armies. When the guns finally fell silent, the Morris C-8 faced its most uncertain task: survival in peacetime. The British Army had built and operated thousands. Now, with war over, they were suddenly redundant. Storage depots across England filled with rows of them, silent, wheels sunk into mud. Their wartime urgency had ended overnight, replaced by a new question. What do you do with a machine built for hardship when the hardship is gone? The answer came from civilians. Farmers, builders and mechanics saw what the army no longer did: potential. A truck that could pull a gun through a swamp could haul a trailer through a field. A winch strong enough to drag a limber from a crater could lift a barn beam. Auction by auction, the quads left the depots and entered a second life. For veterans, owning one was a kind of therapy. They knew every bolt and lever. They'd trusted their lives to those engines. Driving one again, this time through green fields instead of shellfire, felt like a return to something solid. Many converted them into farm vehicles, campers, even makeshift tow trucks. The war had taught them to build from what they had, and the C-8 was the perfect foundation. Across the Commonwealth, they found new homes. In Canada and Australia, they became workhorses for logging and construction. In India and Burma, they served in new armies, painted in new colours but still unmistakably British in their shape and sound. The Morris kept rolling, as if refusing to understand that the war was over. Restorers today speak of them with reverence. They describe the satisfying resistance of the clutch, the low hum of the gearbox, the smell of oil-soaked canvas. They call them honest machines, simple, durable, and built without pretense. One collector said, "When you start a quad, you feel history wake up." Not all survived. Many were scrapped for metal in the austerity years, their steel melted into post-war industry. But even then, they lived on, in bridges, rails, buildings, their substance reshaped into the peace they had helped win. To walk through an old scrapyard in the 1950s was to see ghosts of war resting quietly. Engines without hoods, wheels without tread, dashboards still bearing faint engravings of names. Faithful, Gun Mule, Mrs. Morris. They were reminders that even the most tireless beasts need rest. In every museum, in every field where one of these machines still sits rusting quietly, the Morris C-8 stands as something more than an artifact. It's an argument for simplicity, for endurance, and for the quiet genius of practical engineering. The British called it a tractor. Historians later called it a logistical miracle. But what it truly represented was the industrial soul of its era, the belief that strength was not found in complexity, but in persistence. Its design philosophy outlived the war. Engineers who had worked on the C-8 carried its lessons into every branch of British vehicle development after 1945. The Army's next generation of field tractors, the AEC Matador, the Bedford RL, and eventually the Leyland Martian, all inherited something from it: short wheelbases for tight manoeuvres, accessible mechanics, modular parts. Each was born from the C-8's DNA. The same was true in civilian life. The C-8's four-wheel drive and torque-heavy gearing became a model for post-war agricultural vehicles. You can trace its influence through the Land Rover, first built in 1948, compact, dependable, built for rough terrain, and designed by engineers who remembered the C-8. In its steering column, its axles, even its proportions, you can still see the ghost of the Morris. But its legacy wasn't only mechanical, it was cultural. The crews who drove the C-8 taught armies to think differently about logistics. Before the war, artillery was seen as static power, fire from behind the line, immobile once deployed. The C-8 changed that. It proved that guns could be as mobile as tanks, that firepower could move and adapt. That idea, mobility as force, reshaped doctrine from Korea to the Falklands. Even modern self-propelled artillery owes part of its existence to what the C-8 started. The principle remains the same. A weapon is only as powerful as its ability to move, and a soldier is only as safe as his supply can follow. The quad turned artillery from an anchor into a spear. In design schools, the C-8 is still studied as a case in wartime manufacturing efficiency. It used interchangeable parts long before modular production became industry standard. Its compact cab and sloped armour influenced military truck design worldwide. German, Soviet, and later American engineers examined captured examples, impressed by their toughness despite such humble origins. Even the Soviets admitted, grudgingly, that it embodied the British virtue of persistence. That persistence ran deeper than metal. It reflected a mindset, one that valued endurance over elegance. The Morris didn't dazzle, it endured. It didn't innovate for innovation's sake. It worked because it had to. And that quiet reliability became its true legacy. When you watch footage of later wars, convoys crawling through Korea's mountains, Land Rovers crossing Suez, supply trucks grinding through Afghanistan's dust, you can still see the C-8's shadow. Different shapes, different ages, but the same heart. Torque over glamour, grit over speed, the triumph of the practical. Restorers today speak of how forgiving the machine is to work with. One veteran mechanic called it the perfect teacher. You learn patience, method, and respect. If you rush it, it stalls. If you listen, it hums. It reminds you that even machines have tempers, and good ones have character. At Duxford, one restored C-8 bears a plaque engraved by its wartime crew's descendants. Still pulling. Those two words encapsulate everything. From the first muddy proving ground in 1939 to the museum floor decades later, the Morris C-8 has done exactly what it was built to do: endure. The C-8 didn't win medals, but it won wars. It didn't fly, it didn't fire, but it carried the weapons and men that could. It turned industry into momentum, and momentum into victory. Its steel may have aged, but its lesson never has, that in the end, what moves history forward is not brilliance, but resolve. Every great army has its heroes, the pilots, the tank commanders, the infantrymen who carried rifles into fire. But behind them, always, there are the quiet heroes, the ones who made sure the guns arrived, the ammunition flowed, the food and water reached the front. The Morris C-8 was built for those heroes. It became one itself. Its story was never about glory. It was about service, about the thousands of unseen journeys between one battlefield and another, through mud, snow, and fear. It was the link in the chain that held civilization together while the world tore itself apart. When the veterans of the Royal Artillery gather, their memories often return to the sound, that steady four-cylinder beat echoing through fog or dust. They say it felt alive, like a companion that never asked questions, only followed. Many credit it with saving their lives, hauling them out of ambushes, mud, and broken bridges when nothing else could move. One old driver, long retired, once said, "If a man had half the heart of that machine, he'd never stop." Modern soldiers, looking back through archives, recognize something familiar. Every army still relies on its beasts of burden, machines that may never make headlines, but carry the weight of the war all the same. In that sense, the Morris C-8 never truly left service. It simply evolved, its spirit reincarnated in every vehicle that shoulders more than it should. To walk past one today, paint faded, wheels still, is to feel its quiet dignity. It doesn't demand attention. It just waits, as it always did, ready to move when called. In the end, the Morris C-8 was never built to be remembered. It was built to work, to pull, to carry, to endure. yet memory found it anyway. From the deserts of Libya to the hedgerows of Normandy, from factory floors under fire to quiet English fields after peace, it lived up to its name. The beast that never quit. It outlasted the empires it served, the men who built it, and the wars that gave it purpose. And still, somewhere, in the echo of an engine turning over after decades of silence, you can hear it breathing again, steady, patient, unstoppable. The Morris C8 remains the purest symbol of what industrial Britain once was: determined, durable, and utterly dependable. It didn't conquer through power, but through persistence. And in that persistence lies the secret of victory. Because in every age of war, the machines that truly change history are not the loudest or the fastest. They are the ones that refuse to stop.